Okay, so let's look at the bones and the processes associated with the skull. Let's start with the cranial bones. This bone is the frontal bone. The tops and the sides are the parietal bones. This is the occipital bone, the base of the skull. Then on either side of the skull you have the temporal bone. Then you see the little wing of the backbone that goes all the way through, so that is the sphenoid bone. And then looking in the eye socket, that would be the ethmoid bone. You can also see a little hint of the ethmoid bone in the nose when you look at the superior and middle nasal concha. So ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, temporal bone, parietal, frontal, and occipital. Those are the cranial bones. So let's look at the facial bones now that make up the skull. We see the two nasal bones. We see the inferior nasal concha bones. We see the vomer. We see the maxillary or maxilla bones. We see the mandible. We see the zygomatic bone, and we see the lacrimal bone. From this, looking down into the skull this way, this is the palate of the mouth, or the roof of the mouth, and so just this little back 1/3 is the palatine bone. That would be the palatine process, which is part of the maxillary bone. And so those are the facial bones. Now, there are two other bones associated, two kinds of bones associated with the skull. This is one of them. This is the hyoid bone, and you're going to find it like here. It sits on top of the larynx, and it attaches to the tongue. It is the only bone in the body that does not articulate with any other bone, the hyoid bone. Three other very small bones that we can't see here that are smaller than a dime are found inside the middle ear, and they are the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and we collectively call those the ossicles. So now let's move on to the processes associated with the skull. Let's start with the processes of this temporal bone. This links the temporal bone to the zygomatic bone, so it's known as the zygomatic arch. This is a bump, I say, behind the ear, or a mass behind the ear, so it's the mastoid process. This little stick hanging down that helps to direct nerves and blood vessels is the styloid process. And then the canal, that is going to be the ear canal, is a meatus. It's the external auditory meatus, or sometimes the external acoustic meatus. This is the newer terminology, but it is the canal. Separating the temporal bone from the parietal bone would be the squamosal suture. Let's move to the front of the skull now. Since foramen means hole, these holes that are below the eyes are infraorbital foramen, or foramina is plural. The hole above the eye then would be supraorbital foramen. The hole in the chin would be mental foramen, or foramina. The processes that make the teeth sockets, those are alveolar processes. I've already mentioned that this is the palatine bone, but this is the palatine process of the maxillary bone. This big hole where the spinal cord goes and meets the brain is the biggest hole, so it's called the foramen magnum. The suture that divides the parietals from the frontal is called the coronal suture. The suture that divides the two parietals into right and left is the sagittal suture, and the one that separates the occipital from the parietal is the lambdoid suture. This bump that's on the back of the occipital bone, you can feel it on the back of your head. It's called the external occipital protuberance. And then these two little knuckle-like projections that actually the first vertebrae sit on is the occipital are the occipital condyles. Let's go inside of the cranial cavity to get our last features. When we look inside the cranial cavity, we can see that bat bone, the sphenoid bone, with more clarity. There is a little indention in the middle of the body of the bat, of the sphenoid bone, and that is called the sella turcica. They say it looks like a Turkish saddle. The rider of the saddle is the pituitary gland. These two ridges are the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, whereas this area down here would be the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. You see in the most anterior section of the cranial cavity that we have this little piece that sticks up. They say it looks like a rooster's comb, so Latin for that is crista galli. On either side are the cribriform plates, and the cribriform plates have lots of little holes or foramina in them that allow the olfactory nerves to come from the olfactory mucosa in the nasal cavity and innervate with the olfactory bulbs and tracts of the brain. Cribriform plates. And those are the structures, the bones, the sutures, and the processes that you're responsible for with the skull.